I was a Russian prisoner now, and there were 50 or 60 of us at the collecting centre to which I was taken. There was a German policeman who spoke Russian there, and he was helping to take down our particulars. When he asked me my rank and I told him Lieutenant General, he looked up in surprise. No one had taken any particular interest in me so far, but after that it was different. The policeman rushed off to the Russians with the news, and after a while a Russian colonel arrived with a piece of paper on which he asked me to write my name. This I refused to do, saying that I didn't propose to give anyone a blank cheque. The colonel then condescendingly explained that he needed the signatures of all field officers under an AP, peeled to those German soldiers who were still holding out, calling on them to lay down their arms. I told him that I was a pilot, and that I had nothing whatever to do with military affairs. As far as I knew, the defence of Berlin was in the hands of General Weidling. That was the man he should apply to. He looked at me suspiciously and then began to threaten me. But when this had no effect, he ordered my removal to an empty room, where I was laid out on a table and left. I was very weak from loss of blood, and now I had an attack of ague. I remained on that table for about 2 hours, and then I was carried off to my first interrogation by the GPU, or MVD as it called itself by this time. Having found out who I was, they now wanted to know what had happened to Hitler, whether he was really dead, and if so, whether his body had really been burnt. This was the first time I was questioned on the matter. It was not the last, and at the time I had no idea how much trouble the whole business was going to give me. At my insistent request, I was finally given a glass of water. I was seriously wounded, of course, but I wasn't to be spared the march through Berlin. It appeared that there was a general order that all prisoners should be carted through Berlin to see how many white and red flags there were hanging out everywhere. So I was hoisted into a car and off we went, a light Russian tank following in the rear. We drove out of Berlin to Schönwald, Bernau and back. The roads were, of course, in a very bad state, having been shot to pieces. As the car drove along at speed, I was sometimes thrown right into the air by the bumping, and at such moments the pain in my leg was so excruciating that I screamed. There was a Mongol soldier sitting next to me, and he just nodded his head. Beyond that, it didn't seem to bother him. I was driven round Berlin for a couple of hours. Orders were orders. If by chance I had supposed that after this form of torture I should be taken somewhere for treatment, I would have been mistaken, though I had been promised it. I was now questioned by another GPU interrogator, and at the end of it came the renewed promise, "Hospital will be." That night I was taken by car to a farm near Strasbourg, where there were a dozen other generals, including General Weidling. I still received no medical treatment, and there were further interrogations for a week, and always on the one theme, Hitler's death. At the end of a week, I told the interrogating commissar bluntly, "From now on, I'm not answering any of your questions until you provide me with medical treatment. In any case, you keep asking me the same thing over and over again. Hitler is dead as far as I know, and I believe his body was burnt." Once again, I was asked to sign something. Once again, I refused, and once again, I was threatened. "Shoot me or give me medical attention, one or the other," I said with determination. When the fellow saw that there was really nothing more to be got out of me, he must have given orders to take me to another farm where operations were going on. There were 4 couches covered with American cloth there, and on 3 of them lay wounded Russians still under a general anaesthetic. I was put under an anaesthetic too, but it hadn't worked before someone started to cut. I let out a wild yell of pain, as a result of which they gave me another whiff, whereupon I really went off. When I recovered consciousness, both my legs were in plaster, but I noticed that the plaster on the right leg was soaked with blood. However, for a while I was free of pain. The unwounded generals were taken away a couple of days later and sent off to Moscow by plane. The sick and wounded went to Posen, where there was a vast hospital camp with about 35,000 inmates. There was a desperate shortage of medicine and no surgical instruments at all. Professor Schneider informed me that it would be necessary to open up the plaster, as there was no X-ray apparatus, because in their initial enthusiasm, the comrades had destroyed them all. I was put under an anaesthetic, and what he had to tell me when I came to wasn't encouraging. "They've just slit your whole calf open from top to bottom. Why, I can't tell you, for they didn't even extract the bullet. It was still embedded in the bone. Some of the bone is missing, by the way, but later on, when things settle down, you can have a bone grafting operation." But even that wasn't too encouraging, because now my leg began to suppurate, and I fell very ill. I had weighed 190 pounds, now I weighed 110. At last, and with a heavy heart, I had to give permission for my leg to be amputated. There was no scalpel available, so the German surgeon amputated with a pocket knife. On my return, I received a letter from a pastor who said he still had the pocket knife with which the job was done. After the operation, I was put in a tent. It was heated by a stove whose chimney pipe went through the canvas roof, with the result that the canvas often caught fire. And one stormy night, the whole thing fell in on us and the pipe dropped down on my bed. After that, at least I was put into a proper building, and that would have been a great advantage but for the bedbugs. There were two things which stayed with me throughout my impris. On ment, one of them was kashar, the coarse millet porridge which was the chief source of our nourishment, and the other was bedbugs. There were myriads of them in Posen. In one night I took the trouble to count my bag, 640. Not that there was any sense in killing them even in such numbers. There were far too many of them, but at least it gave you something to do. A woman doctor with the rank of captain was in charge of our hospital, and one day she came to me and informed me that I was now well enough to be sent to a sanatorium in Moscow with the other German generals, where I should be well looked after and get plenty to eat and a daily ration of schnapps, a point which the Russians seemed to regard as of great importance. It sounded all right. I had succeeded in getting a former telephonist in the Reich Chancellery, a corporal named Misch, allowed as my batman, and now, with some difficulty, I got permission for him to accompany me to Moscow, though I'm not sure that it turned out to his advantage. Incidentally, whilst I was still in Posen, I sent 12 letters to my wife through fellows who were going back, but, as I learned afterwards, she received only 2 of them. On the 24th November, 450 of us were loaded into cattle trucks to make the journey to Moscow. The train had 80 trucks, but they were not all at our disposal because some of the booty of war was being taken back to Moscow with us. Furniture, factory equipment, pianos, horses, cattle, old stoves, stovepipes, baths, old water pipes, and so on. We actually went to a prison camp at Mosheysk, about 70 miles this side of Moscow, and because I was to be sent on to this general's sanatorium, I was quartered outside the camp. After a while, I set off with a group of other officers and my batman, Misch. In Moscow, we had to wait for a long time in a waiting room, and then a small Opel car picked us up. The sanatorium turned out to be a prison. One look at the forbidding gates was enough. It was, in fact, the notorious Butyrka. Misch and I were put together in a cell, which was just about big enough to take 2, and there we waited. Waiting was another thing we were to get very used to. At about 4 o'clock in the morning, we were woken up to have our particulars taken, and an officer informed me that henceforth the wearing of rank badges, medals, and so on was forbidden. When he had taken away everything there was to take away, I was given the usual assurance that someday I should get it all back again. It didn't take us long to learn that the phrase we were constantly fobbed off with, "we'll get everything," needed the words "taken away" added to bring it into line with reality. We were not alone. Generals Weidling and Rattenhuber, for example, were both in prison with us. By comparison with what we had so far been given in Russian hands, the food wasn't too bad, though I couldn't get enthusiastic about the fish soup. You could spot a fish's head or fish bones in it occasionally, but never a piece of fish, and we had that soup every day of the year. From time to time my stump was given light treatment, and I was assured that before long it would be all right. But it, will be, was another expression we got very used to. It was the future tense, and therefore it never needed to be true, though it was always going to be. Jam tomorrow, but never jam today. The interrogations went on, and I made the acquaintance of a man who was to stick to me like a leech for years. He was the GPU agent who had my case in hand, and his name was Dr. Savelli. At first everything was more or less right and proper, though my examiner preferred night work, as being more inconvenient to me. The first night he just got me to tell him about the final hours in the Reich Chancellery, whilst he scribbled away like mad. Neither Mish nor I told them that we had known each other in the Reich Chancellery, and Mish, having seen what being in the Reich Chancellery had done for me, was very anxious to avoid any mention of the fact that he had been there too. But they got to know about it somehow, and one evening during an interrogation, this Dr. Savelli suddenly threw a book at Mish and said, "Well, Mish, how was it in the Reich Chancellery? Tell me all about it." Poor Mish was so flabbergasted that he couldn't conceal his astonishment. After that we were separated. When I met him again later, he told me that he had been badly knocked about. The Russians had beaten him unconscious 5 times, thrashed him on the soles of the feet, and then thrown a bucket of water over him, brought him to, kicked him in the backside and sent him back to his cell. They knew he had been a telephonist in the Reich Chancellery, and therefore they assumed that he must have heard everything. They weren't prepared to believe that there was an ingenious device which prevented the telephonists from hearing a thing once they had put the call through. I was interrogated almost daily for 2 months, and then I was transferred to the Lubyanka, the no less notorious GPU prison, where, as I learned at once, Grand Admiral Raeder and his wife and Field Marshal Schörner were also being held. In the Lubyanka they weren't satisfied with hearing what we had to say. We had to write it all down. Sometimes I was scribbling away for 6 hours a day, all about... Well, all about what? 3 guesses, the last hours in the Reich Chancellery. I wrote 130 pages of it, but when my interrogating commissar read it, he just tore up the last 30 pages in front of my eyes and asked me whether I was silly enough to think they were going to be deceived by such rubbish. They just weren't prepared to believe that I had told them all I knew, and my commissar told me menacingly that there were ways and means. The machinery of intimidation started up in earnest now. First of all, they cut down my food until I was so weak that I couldn't stand properly, and had to be half carried along to interrogation. I also began to suffer from fits of giddiness, for which the doctor prescribed some very bitter medicine which did no good at all. And why should it have done? All I needed was a bit more to eat. One night I was taken out of my cell and brought before General Kapulov. He was afterwards shot with his chief Beria. "Now look, Bauer," he said. "You were in everything we know, and now you want to tell us you don't know anything." I pointed out that I had already written 130 pages setting out all I knew, and that there was nothing more I could say. At which he laughed and said I would have to change my mind one day, so why not now? In the meantime, he was leaving me in good hands. The 2 officers with him had instructions to persuade me to talk freely. "They won't hesitate to treat you very rough, Bauer. We, naturally, don't like beating up generals, but your attitude forces our hand." After that I was taken from the Lubyanka and sent back to the Butyrka, and the whole thing started again from scratch as though nothing at all had happened in the meantime. There were endless series of interrogations in the old fashion. Myself, Rattenhuber, Hitler's valet Linger, Admiral Voss, 2 German detectives named Hofbeck and Henschel, Sturmbannleader Günsche and my unfortunate Batman, Misch, were all taken together to the examination room one night, and there everything we had was taken away from us. Even any bandages were ripped off. I happened to have a nasty boil at the time. Then some old rags were given to us. My share was a pair of trousers about right in size for a boy of 15. I was also given a bast shoe for the 1 foot I had left. In this get-up and objects of great amusement, we suffered 21 successive nights of interrogation from midnight until 5 o'clock in the morning. and when we got back to our cells, we were not allowed to make up for the sleep we had lost. A favourite trick was to play one of us off against the other, but when you asked to be confronted with the fellow who had allegedly said that or this about you, your examiner always changed the subject. My particular examiner was always running round in excited circles, and when he paused for a moment it was usually to swallow all sorts of pills, apparently to set him up again. What he wanted me to tell him was that Hitler wasn't really dead at all, and that I had flown him away to some place of safety. According to him, this was also what the Americans believed. Now, where had I flown him? You might wonder why. If I had flown Hitler to safety, I had returned to the Reich Chancellery and let myself be taken prisoner. But that was just the devilish ingenuity of it all. It was to put them off the scent. Nor was this all. My adjutant, Colonel Betts, had been in the know, and as such knowledge was dangerous, I had murdered him to make sure he could never talk. This was the first I had heard that he was dead. However, if I only told them where Hitler was now, everything would be all right. In fact, I would be liberally rewarded and given a good job in Chile, or if I felt I wouldn't be safe abroad after that, I could stay in Russia. The whole thing was ludicrous, but grimly so, and sometimes I used to wonder whether I was still in my right mind, for they insistently asked me exactly the same questions over and over again, using exactly the same threats, and then exactly the same promises. Throughout all this, I wasn't allowed to sleep properly, and I was given less and less food. One day, after swallowing a handful of pills, my examiner sprang a special surprise on me. Hitler hadn't committed suicide at all, and the body which had been burnt in the forecourt of the Reichschancellery had been that of a double, who had been shot and then burnt. Now it was a fact that on one occasion there had been some talk about using a double to represent Hitler, and as early as 1934, Rattenhuber, who was then head of the Reich Security Service, had approached me and asked me to let Hitler know in the course of conversation that he, Rattenhuber, had a man who greatly resembled him, and that with a little titivation the man could easily pass for him if necessary. I passed on the information as requested, but Hitler only laughed, saying he wasn't Stalin and didn't need a double. I told my examiner to ask Rattenhuber about it. He might still know where the man was. If by chance he happened to be still alive, they could convince themselves that nothing of the sort had taken place. 4 weeks later, my examiner was beaming. "Bauer," he exclaimed, "we've got hold of that man. You could never tell when they were telling the truth or not. In any case, as far as I was concerned, that was the last I heard of Hitler's double. But it wasn't the end of my interrogations. The Russians were ingenious at concocting new methods. For example, at one period we were all busily engaged in drawing sketches of the Reich Chancellery, showing all the actual entrances and all the possible ones. One night I was given a terrible shock. I went along to my interrogation as usual, and the examiner glared at me and shouted triumphantly, "Bohr, you're going to tell us what you know now, or else. In a day or so your wife will be here, and if you don't talk, then we'll rip her knickers off in front of you. And if that's not enough, we'll turn her over and thrash her. And if even that doesn't loosen you up, we'll make her into a whore." That was a bad night for me. Such threats may sound fantastic, but from one or two things that had already come to my knowledge, they were to be taken seriously. In fact, when I returned home in 1955, I learned that at the time an attempt had actually been made to kidnap my wife. A man got into touch with her, telling her that I was in Czechoslovakia and claiming to be able to get me released. He would need 2,000 marks. However, and as an earnest of his authenticity, my wife would have to go with him. In their desperation, my wife, who has now been dead 2 years, and her mother fell for this swindler, and my wife went with him by train as far as Marktredwitz, from where they went on foot through the woods to the Czech frontier. But shortly before the frontier, my wife's strength gave out, and she could go no farther. The man went off, allegedly to get help, but he never came back, and in the meantime a frontier patrol came along and found my wife. One day I and others were given our things and put on a train. From the position of the sun we could tell that we were travelling westward. We travelled for 9 days, and during that time our daily rations consisted of some brownish water from the locomotive, half a salt herring and about a pound of bread. We arrived in Berlin, half-starved. We thought that we knew a thing or two about bad prison conditions, but Berlin, Lichtenberg. Prison under the Russians beat the lot. The warders were sadists who took pleasure in beating up their prisoners. One day my cell door was wrenched open and I was beaten up and left half unconscious on the floor. Vaguely I heard through a mist of pain that it was because I had been sitting on the edge of my bed. However, we hadn't been brought to Berlin just for those brutes to kick us around, or to make the acquaintance of cells in which there was often nothing but one pail for all purposes, washing, fetching soup, urinating, and so on. So after 4 weeks of this, I was brought before a GPU commissar, a man whose face I knew from Moscow. He told me that the bodies of Hitler and his wife had not been burnt at all, but preserved, and that I had been brought to Berlin to identify them. Linger, Hitler's valet, was also with us, and he was taken to the ruins of the Reich Chancellery and made to explain all the ins and outs of the place. A man who had been a member of the anti-Hitler movement in Germany and was now a trustee in Lichtenberg prison, told me that he had been present when the Russians dug up all the corpses buried in the forecourt of the Reich Chancellery. They had found 2 charred bodies, and these had probably been preserved, as had the bodies of Goebbels and his family. Actually, I was never called upon to inspect any body. One day I was interrogated by a Russian colonel in connection with a statement allegedly made by Detective Hofbeck that I had actually been present at the burning of Hitler's body. And then I was asked whether I was quite certain that the man who had said goodbye to me as Hitler actually was Hitler. Now I had been with Hitler for hours on end on many hundreds of occasions throughout the years, and I had known him as well as a man can know anyone. In particular, I knew that odd mixture of Austrian and Bavarian accent which was typical of him. It was therefore really out of the question that anyone, no matter how alike, could have been palmed off on me as Hitler. I made this statement to the colonel and signed it. After that, I was sent back to Moscow. On the way we stopped in Brest-Litovsk, and there I was taken to the local prison and forced to crawl up the prison steps because I couldn't manage it alone with my crutches. The pail in my cell leaked, with the result that the floor was damp with urine and excrement and stank abominably. The warder then ordered me to wipe up the floor with the one handkerchief I had, and this I steadfastly refused to do. After 4 days of this, with a plague of bedbugs to enliven the nights, I was taken out of this cell and put into another. An hour later I was taken back to the old cell, which, in the meantime, had been wiped up. But in one corner the damp floor cloth had been used to write the name Misch, so my unfortunate Batman was here too. It may sound astonishing, but all things are relative, and we were glad to get back to the Butyrka. A few days later I was told that in all probability we should soon be sent to a camp. For anyone in prison, such a prospect is the promise of the little freedom. You're still a prisoner, but at least you're amongst other people, and life isn't quite so monotonous and circumscribed. But it turned out to be a false hope, and it was almost a year before they thought of me again. Then I was brought before General Kapolov once more. The sands were running out fast for him, though he didn't know it. "Well, Bauer," he demanded, "have you changed your mind? Are you prepared to tell us what you know now?" There it was again. All I could say was that I had already told them all I knew, to which he replied, "Please yourself, Bauer, but you'll stay here 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, to the end of your days. Unless you do decide to tell us what we want to know." And with a cynical grin he had me sent back to my cell. What he said sounded only too true, and it was all true, except the words, "to the end of your days." By the time I had suffered this sort of thing for 3.5 years, I felt that I had had enough. I had not been allowed to receive any letters from my family or to write any. In my desperation, I now decided that I would end it, one way or the other, so I presented an ultimatum. Unless you release me and send me home within 3 months, I shall go on hunger strike, to the end. Nothing at all happened, so when the 3 months were up, I went on hunger strike. On the third day a doctor, a woman, came into my cell and informed me that hunger striking was forbidden in Russia. It was regarded as an anti-government demonstration, and as such it was severely punished. When I refused to be moved, she tried to persuade me. It was very silly. What good could it do? And in any case, I certainly shouldn't be allowed to starve myself. She would see to that. I remained firm. I wanted to get out. I wanted to see grass and green leaves again. I wanted to hear from my family. The next day I was taken down to a punishment cell, which happened to be in the women's wing, and there the forced feeding began. There were quite a lot of them for the job, several officers, several men, and a nurse, carrying a long, flexible piece of rubber tubing with a glass nozzle at one end, and the other immersed in a container with some frothy liquid in it. I was asked whether I would consent to eat, and when I refused, 4 men seized me by the arms and legs, whilst the sister resolutely bored the glass nozzle into my nostrils. She couldn't manage it because it was much too large, but she ripped my nostrils and the blood poured down over my chin and onto my chest. Then I lost consciousness. When I came to, the nozzle was down my throat. I immediately vomited everything up, nozzle, liquid and all. Then a thinner nozzle was produced, and the game started up again. The men who were holding me seemed to enjoy it, and my howls of pain only made them laugh. When they had pumped all the liquid into me, they left me half unconscious on the floor of the cell and went off, promising me another performance the next day. The next day the sister came in alone, no doubt hoping that the previous day's performance had been sufficient to intimidate me, but I still refused to eat, so then the warders trooped in, and the thing was repeated. This time I shrieked so wildly that the women in the neighbouring cells began to panic. Once again the party went off, again with the promise that they would return the following day, which they did. I asked the sister to get a thinner nozzle, but she refused. I then appealed to the doctor, who was usually quite conscientious, but she said that it was entirely up to me. I held the solution in my own hand. I should eat. Until I did, she could do nothing for me. She could not order a thinner nozzle, and she could not order the forced feeding to take place through the gullet just because my nostrils were torn and the mucous membrane injured. On the 4th day the doctor herself stood in the doorway and watched the proceedings, and before long the tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't interfere. She had her orders too. When I was alone again, I started to get out a small thin piece of steel which was hidden in the collar of my coat, keeping my eyes on the Judas hole whilst I worked. I had whetted that piece of steel to raise a sharpness on the stones of my cell, and I was determined that if I couldn't end it one way, I would end it the other. But suddenly the door was wrenched open, and a warder came in, who from time to time had shown me a little human sympathy. He looked at me and then went out again. Hastily I rolled my coat up and put it away. But GPU men now came in and took away the coat. At first they found nothing, but they were thorough and patient and experienced, and finally the small piece of steel came to light. After that they searched everything. The pail was taken away, and even the bench on which I sat. I also had to strip stark naked, and they took every stitch of clothing away from me, after which I was given new old clothes. I was pretty whacked now. Apparently I couldn't end even my sufferings, and going on with that forced feeding torture was useless, as the doctor had said in the first place. I could have starved myself slowly to death, but I wasn't to be allowed to. For about an hour I sat there on the cell floor and my thoughts were despairing. I was helpless. There was nothing I could do. So I decided to start eating again. The doctor came in, beaming. The warder came in, beaming. You would have thought I had done something kind and wonderful for them all. They even wanted to send me to hospital, but I told the doctor I would prefer to go back to my own cell. There was just one more job I had to do. Warn a Hungarian fellow prisoner against following my example. In my cell I was provided with special food at the doctor's orders, and I was given pencil and paper, on which to compose a request to be brought before the prison governor. I wasn't, but 3 days later I was sent off to a camp. There were other Germans there with whom I could talk, and I no longer had to sit for hours and hours in a cell on my own. At least my sufferings seemed to have done some good. About 100 miles or so due south of Moscow lies Stalinogorsk, the centre of a large coal mining area. There are a good many forced labour camps in the area, whose inmates are largely Russian. But from 1945 to 1950 there were 16 of these camps from which many thousands of German prisoners of war trudged out every day to work in the mines. The seams are not very deep, the workings are very damp, the equipment is primitive, and the safety measures very inadequate by German standards. After a night in a prison train, I arrived at Stalinogorsk the following morning and got out of the train with thousands of Russian prisoners, to be met by large numbers of guards with Tommy guns and dogs. I was new to the game, and so I was surprised when on reaching the ground everyone knelt down. I spent the night in the Stalinogorsk Upravlenie, and the next morning I was taken by lorry to camp number 3. The first thing I saw was a wretched column of men in ragged clothing wearing miners' hats. At first I thought they were Russians, but when 1 or 2 people recognized me and called out my name, I realized that they were German prisoners of war going off to work in the mines. In this camp, one pleasant experience did at least await me. I was allowed to have a bath and shave. In prison, all we ever had was scissors with which to trim our beards. A medical examination showed that I was undernourished, and I was told that I should stay in the sickbay for 2 weeks. I asked for newspapers, and I was given them, and for the first time for nearly 4 years I got news of the outside world, even though it did come through the East Zone filter. Before long the first faces began to appear at the window, and it turned out that I had quite a lot of acquaintances in the place. Everyone grumbled bitterly about life in the camp, and they found it a bit difficult to